December 3, 1943. Monte la Difensa, Italy. Oberleutnant Klaus Fischer stood in a command bunker carved into rock that German engineers had declared impregnable. Behind him, 3 defensive lines stretched up a mountain whose steep slopes, icy conditions, and prepared positions made assault seem impossible. Before him, intelligence reports described an Allied unit attempting what 5 previous attacks had failed to achieve, taking this mountain that anchored the German winter line and blocked the Allied advance toward Rome. Fischer had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. He had defended positions against Soviet human wave attacks, British artillery bombardments, American armor assaults. He understood military mathematics. Attackers needed numerical superiority, preferably 3-to-1, to overcome prepared defenses. The unit approaching his position was outnumbered, attacking uphill through winter conditions, advancing against positions that offered defenders every advantage. Yet something in the intelligence reports troubled him. This unit, officially the 1st Special Service Force, unofficially called the Devil's Brigade, had trained specifically for mountain warfare. They operated at night when visibility favored neither side. They used unconventional tactics that German defensive doctrine hadn't anticipated. Fischer checked his defensive preparations one final time and waited for an assault that would demonstrate why conventional military calculations sometimes failed against unconventional opponents. The 1st Special Service Force emerged from a strategic concept that combined American industrial capacity with Canadian military expertise. In 1942, British strategists proposed operations against German-occupied Norway, targeting hydroelectric facilities and strategic installations in terrain characterized by mountains, forests, and extreme weather. Conventional infantry units lacked the specialized training for operations in these conditions. Existing commando forces were committed to other theaters. The situation demanded a new unit specifically designed for combat in mountainous winter environments. The proposal reached American and Canadian military leadership, who agreed to form a joint force. The unit would recruit volunteers from both nations, train them for mountain and winter warfare, and develop tactics for operations in terrain where conventional approaches failed. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Frederick, a young American officer with reputation for innovative thinking, received command with instructions to create a unit capable of operating effectively in conditions that neutralized conventional military advantages. Frederick's recruitment criteria emphasized physical capability and psychological adaptability. He sought men with outdoor experience, lumberjacks, hunters, mountaineers, individuals comfortable in wilderness environments. He also recruited from military stockades, offering prisoners opportunity to clear records through volunteer service in a unit that promised extremely hazardous duty. The combination produced personnel who combined physical toughness with willingness to accept extraordinary risks. The training was conducted in Montana, where terrain and weather approximated Norwegian conditions. The program lasted 6 months and emphasized skills beyond standard infantry training: rock climbing, skiing, cold weather survival, parachute operations, demolitions, and close-quarters combat. Frederick insisted on cross-training across all specialties. Every soldier received instruction in weapons, communications, medical treatment, and explosives. The philosophy was that small units operating independently needed members who could perform multiple roles if casualties reduced team capabilities. The training intensity exceeded conventional military programs. Soldiers conducted forced marches covering 30 miles through mountain terrain carrying full combat loads. They practiced rock climbing on cliffs where falls meant serious injury or death. They operated in temperatures that dropped below 0 Fahrenheit, learning through experience how cold affected weapons, equipment, and human performance. The attrition rate was substantial. Approximately 40% of volunteers failed to complete training, but those who remained formed a unit whose capabilities far exceeded standard infantry. The unit's structure reflected its unconventional nature. Rather than traditional company organization, the force used smaller, more flexible sections that could operate independently. Officers and enlisted men trained together, ate together, and developed relationships based on competence rather than rank. This egalitarian approach was unusual in 1940s military culture, but created unit cohesion that would prove essential during combat operations, where small teams might be isolated from command for extended periods. By late 1943, the planned Norwegian operations had been cancelled. Changing strategic priorities made them unnecessary. But the 1st Special Service Force remained a highly trained unit seeking operational deployment. The Italian campaign provided that opportunity. Allied forces advancing north from Sicily had encountered the German Winter Line, a defensive system anchoring on mountainous terrain that favored defenders. Monte la Difensa, a 3,000-foot peak with nearly vertical approaches, had repelled multiple Allied attacks. British, American, and Canadian conventional units had attempted assault and suffered heavy casualties without achieving success. The mountain's defensive advantages were substantial. German engineers had spent months preparing positions, bunkers carved into rock, machine gun nests commanding every approach route, artillery positions on reverse slopes protected from counter-battery fire, and minefields covering the few accessible paths. The slopes were so steep that attacking infantry struggled to maintain footing while carrying equipment. Winter weather created additional challenges. Ice made rock climbing treacherous, cold affected weapon reliability, and limited visibility reduced the effectiveness of Allied air support and artillery. 5th Army Command, frustrated by repeated failures to take the mountain, turned to unconventional options. Intelligence officers reviewed available units and identified the 1st Special Service Force as possessing capabilities that might succeed where conventional assaults had failed. Frederick received orders to conduct reconnaissance and develop assault plans, with the explicit understanding that his unit would attempt what others had found impossible. Frederick's reconnaissance revealed why previous attacks had failed. Conventional assaults followed predictable patterns, advancing along obvious routes, attacking during daylight when visibility aided coordination, relying on artillery preparation to suppress defenders. German defensive plans anticipated these approaches and positioned forces accordingly. Every obvious attack route was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every likely assembly area was pre-registered for artillery strikes. Frederick developed plans that violated conventional assault doctrine. The force would attack at night, eliminating German visibility advantages. They would climb the steepest sections, routes so difficult that German defenders assumed they were impassable and left them lightly guarded. They would conduct the assault without preliminary artillery bombardment, accepting that surprise was more valuable than suppressive fire that would alert defenders to the attack timing. Small teams would advance independently, rather than in coordinated waves, infiltrating German positions before defenders recognized that assault was underway. The plan was audacious to the point of seeming reckless. 5th Army staff officers reviewing Frederick's proposal noted numerous risks. Soldiers might fall during night climbing, teams could become disoriented in darkness. The lack of artillery support meant attackers would face German fire without suppression. But conventional approaches had failed repeatedly. Unconventional tactics, however risky, offered the only realistic possibility of success. The assault began at 1900 hours on December 2, 1943. 600 men of the 1st Special Service Force began climbing Monte la Difensa in complete darkness, moving in small teams spaced to prevent one group's discovery from compromising others. They carried minimal equipment, weapons, ammunition, water, and climbing gear, leaving behind everything non-essential. The climb itself was technically challenging even in daylight. At night, with ice-covered rock and the need for absolute silence, it pushed physical and psychological limits. The soldiers moved by touch, finding handholds and footholds through careful exploration, testing each grip before committing weight. They climbed roped together in small groups, so that if one man fell, others could arrest his descent. The cold was severe, temperatures near freezing made worse by wind that increased as they ascended. Several men suffered minor injuries during the climb, but the teams continued upward, knowing that stopping meant exposure and possible hypothermia. German defenders heard occasional sounds, rock dislodged by climbing soldiers, equipment scraping against stone, but dismissed them as natural mountain noises. Their defensive doctrine assumed that the steep southern face was impassable, that any serious assault would come along the more accessible approaches where machine guns and artillery were concentrated. A few sentries reported suspicious sounds to their officers, but in darkness and wind, pinpointing exact locations was impossible. The 1st Force teams reached German defensive positions around midnight. They had climbed approximately 1,000 vertical feet through terrain German engineers had declared impossible for assault. Now they moved among German positions in darkness, using knives and silenced weapons to eliminate sentries before defenders could raise alarms. The fighting was close and brutal, hand-to-hand combat in confined spaces where firearms were often useless. As more force teams reached the summit, They began attacking German positions from unexpected directions. Defenders who had oriented their weapons to cover downslope approaches found themselves engaged from behind or from flanks they had considered secure. The confusion was compounded by darkness. German soldiers couldn't distinguish attacking forces from their own troops in the chaos. By 400 hours, the force had secured several key German positions, but they held only a small portion of the mountain, and German commanders were organizing counterattacks to retake lost ground. The initial assault had succeeded through surprise and unconventional approach, but now the force faced sustained combat against defenders who outnumbered them and occupied prepared positions throughout the remaining defensive lines. The real battle was just beginning. Dawn revealed the tactical situation in brutal clarity. The force held positions on the mountain's upper slopes, but they were exposed, outnumbered, and beyond the range of effective artillery support from Allied positions below. German forces, recovering from the night's surprise, began systematic counterattacks designed to push the invaders off the mountain. The German response followed standard doctrine: concentrate artillery on captured positions, then conduct infantry assaults supported by machine gun fire. The bombardment began at first light, shells impacting among the rocks where force soldiers had taken cover. The positions that German engineers had prepared for defense now became shelters for the attackers. Deep bunkers protected force soldiers from indirect fire, though the constant bombardment created psychological stress and prevented rest or resupply. German infantry attacks came in waves throughout December 3rd. Each assault followed similar patterns: artillery preparation, then infantry advancing under machine gun covering fire, attempting to overwhelm force positions through superior numbers. The force defenders used tactics developed during training: precise rifle fire that targeted German officers and machine gunners first, disrupting attack coordination, small counterattacks that hit German formations from unexpected angles, and constant movement that prevented German artillery from effectively targeting defending positions. The fighting was intense and continuous. German commanders committed reserves, believing that sustained pressure would eventually break the numerically inferior force defenders. Several positions changed hands multiple times. German attacks would overrun force soldiers, then small counterattacks would retake the positions minutes later. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the force maintained control of key positions that anchored their defensive line. German officers began reporting to higher command that they faced an unusually capable opponent. After-action reports described force soldiers as demonstrating exceptional marksmanship, aggressive counterattack tactics, and willingness to accept casualties that would cause conventional units to withdraw. One German company commander noted that his unit had achieved local superiority in numbers and firepower, but still failed to dislodge defenders who seemed to refuse acknowledgement of tactical disadvantage. By evening of December 3rd, the force had held their positions for over 24 hours despite continuous German attacks, but they were exhausted, running low on ammunition, and had suffered significant casualties. Medical evacuation was impossible. The routes they had climbed were impassable for carrying wounded, and German fire controlled the more accessible approaches. Wounded force soldiers received treatment from medics operating without adequate supplies, then often returned to fighting positions because every rifle was needed to maintain the defensive line. The question was not whether the force could hold indefinitely, clearly they could not, but whether reinforcements could reach them before German attacks overwhelmed the exhausted defenders. The night of December 4th brought a critical decision. Force positions were marginally secure but unsustainable without reinforcement and resupply. Frederick coordinated with 5th Army Command to send additional force units up the mountain, along with supplies carried by soldiers who would make the same difficult climb the assault teams had completed 2 nights earlier. The reinforcement operation demonstrated the unit's exceptional training. Soldiers who had not participated in the initial assault now climbed the mountain at night carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food, and water, in addition to their personal equipment. They followed routes marked by the assault teams, but the climbing remained dangerous. Several men fell, some suffering serious injuries, a few dying before they could be recovered. The Germans, recognizing that Allied forces were reinforcing their mountain positions, intensified artillery bombardment of likely approach routes. They also positioned snipers and machine gun teams to interdict the climbing soldiers, though darkness limited their effectiveness. Several firefights erupted on the mountain slopes as German patrols encountered force reinforcement teams, Brief, violent exchanges illuminated by muzzle flashes before both sides broke contact and withdrew into darkness. By dawn on December 4th, force strength on the mountain had increased to approximately 900 soldiers, and ammunition supplies had been partially replenished. The reinforcement bought time, but didn't solve the fundamental problem. The force held exposed positions on a mountain whose remaining defensive lines were still occupied by German forces who retained numerical advantage and secure supply lines. German commanders recognized they faced an unusual situation. Conventional military logic suggested that the attackers, outnumbered and isolated on exposed mountainside positions, should be vulnerable to concentrated assault, yet repeated attacks had failed to dislodge them. The German officers began reassessing their opponent, noting in reports that this unit demonstrated capabilities exceeding standard Allied infantry. Intelligence officers interrogated several captured force soldiers, men wounded and left behind during German counterattacks, and compiled information about the unit's training, organization, and capabilities. The intelligence summary that resulted noted extensive specialized training, exceptional physical conditioning, and tactical doctrine that emphasized aggressive action even when outnumbered. The report concluded that this unit represented a new category of Allied forces, specifically trained for operations where conventional units would fail. German defensive doctrine, developed through years of combat experience, provided responses to conventional attacks. But doctrine offered limited guidance for combating opponents who climbed supposedly impassable cliffs at night, who counterattacked when defensive posture was tactically appropriate, who maintained combat effectiveness despite casualties and supply difficulties that would cause normal units to withdraw. The force had created tactical problems that German military experience hadn't prepared them to solve efficiently. The battle for Monte la Defensa continued through December 4 or 5 as the force gradually expanded their perimeter, attacking German positions that remained on the mountain. Each advance required careful assault against prepared defensive positions, close quarters fighting in terrain that offered minimal cover, and constant awareness that German artillery could target any position that attackers exposed themselves to capture. The force tactics adapted to mountain combat conditions. Small teams, typically 6 to 8 men, would approach German positions from unexpected directions, often climbing around defensive positions rather than attacking directly. These flanking movements took advantage of terrain features that conventional military thinking considered impassable. German defenders, oriented to cover obvious approaches, found themselves engaged from angles they hadn't anticipated. The psychological impact on German defenders became increasingly evident. Soldiers who had successfully defended positions against conventional Allied attacks now faced opponents who appeared unexpectedly, attacked with aggressive intensity, and refused to withdraw even when tactical logic suggested retreat. German unit cohesion began degrading. Some positions withdrew without orders when they heard force teams approaching, unwilling to face close-quarters combat with opponents whose reputation was spreading through defensive lines. By December 6th, the force had secured most of Monte la Defensa. German forces withdrew to secondary defensive positions on adjacent peaks, abandoning the mountain that had anchored their defensive line. The withdrawal was conducted in good order. German military discipline remained effective, but the fact that withdrawal occurred at all demonstrated that the force had achieved what multiple conventional assaults had failed to accomplish. The casualty statistics told a sobering story. The force had suffered approximately 500 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, from a total strength of roughly 1,600 engaged in the operation. This represented a casualty rate that would devastate conventional units, yet the force maintained combat effectiveness and achieved their objective. German casualties were comparable in absolute numbers, but represented a smaller percentage of the larger defending force. Fifth Army Command recognized the significance of the victory beyond the tactical capture of one mountain. The German Winterline's strength depended on anchoring positions on terrain that favored defense. Once Monte la Defensa fell, adjacent positions became vulnerable to similar tactics. The force had demonstrated that German defensive doctrine, however well executed, could be defeated by opponents willing to attempt approaches that seemed impossible and accept casualties that seemed unsustainable. German commanders conducting after-action analysis struggled to develop countermeasures. How could they defend against attackers who climbed routes that defensive plans assumed were impassable? How could they prevent infiltration by small teams that operated at night beyond the range of effective observation? The tactical problems the force created didn't have simple solutions within existing German defensive doctrine. Following Monte la Difensa, the 1st Special Service Force received assignments for additional operations against German defensive positions throughout the Italian campaign. Their reputation, earned through demonstrated capability rather than propaganda, preceded them. German intelligence officers distributed information about the unit to defensive commands, warning that conventional defensive preparations might prove inadequate against this opponent. The force's next major operation targeted Monte la Remetanea, another key position in the Winter Line. German defenders, aware of force capabilities from Monte la Difensa, implemented enhanced security measures, increased patrols along approaches previously considered impassable, improved night observation procedures, concentrated reserves positioned for rapid response to infiltration. These countermeasures demonstrated that German command was adapting, learning from experience, attempting to develop doctrine for countering unconventional tactics. The assault followed similar patterns to Monte la Difensa: night movement, approach through difficult terrain, surprise attacks against defensive positions from unexpected directions. But this time German defenders were prepared, and the fighting was even more intense. German patrols encountered force teams during their approach, triggering firefights that alerted defensive positions to the incoming assault. Artillery fire began targeting likely infiltration routes before force soldiers reached German positions. Despite enhanced German defensive measures, the force captured their objective, though at higher cost than Monte la Difensa. The casualties reflected improved German preparations. Defenders who anticipated unconventional approach routes, who maintained better night discipline, who responded more quickly to initial contact. Yet even with these improvements, German forces couldn't prevent the force from achieving their mission objectives. The pattern repeated through subsequent operations in early 1944. The force would receive assignments to capture positions that had resisted conventional assault. They would conduct reconnaissance, develop unconventional approaches, execute attacks that combined surprise with aggressive tactics. German defenders would implement countermeasures based on previous force operations. Fighting would be intense. Casualties would be high on both sides, but the force consistently achieved objectives. German after-action reports from this period show increasing frustration. Unit commanders noted that defending against the force required resource allocation that exceeded defending against conventional Allied units. Enhanced patrols consumed personnel needed elsewhere. Improved observation procedures required additional soldiers for sentry duties. Reserve forces held back for rapid response to force infiltration couldn't be committed to other defensive needs. The force was achieving strategic effect beyond direct combat results. They forced German commanders to allocate disproportionate resources toward defending against a single relatively small unit. By early 1944, German soldiers throughout the Italian theater knew about the Devil's Brigade. The nickname, originally Allied propaganda, had been adopted by German forces themselves, who used it in communications and reports. The name carried psychological weight, representing an opponent who operated beyond conventional limitations and achieved results that seemed disproportionate to their numbers. The Anzio operation demonstrated the force's capabilities in different tactical circumstances. Following the Allied amphibious landing at Anzio in January 1944, the beachhead became a contested stalemate. German forces surrounded the Allied perimeter, containing it through continuous pressure while Allied forces struggled to break out. The force was deployed to hold a critical section of the defensive line, approximately 8 miles of front that would normally require several battalions to defend adequately. Conventional defensive doctrine suggested that spreading 1,600 soldiers across 8 miles created dangerous vulnerabilities. The line would be too thin, positions would be insufficiently supported, German probes would find gaps to exploit. The force approached the problem unconventionally. Rather than establishing static positions and waiting for German attacks, they conducted aggressive patrols into German-held territory, creating uncertainty about Allied defensive positions and forcing German forces to maintain defensive posture along their own lines. The force patrols operated at night, small teams that infiltrated German positions, gathered intelligence, conducted raids against supply points and command posts, and created impression of Allied strength far exceeding actual numbers. German units facing the force sector reported constant pressure, frequent contact with Allied patrols, and difficulty maintaining secure rear areas. Intelligence assessments suggested the Allies had committed substantial forces to this sector. when in reality, the force was conducting economy of force operations with minimal personnel. One particular patrol operation exemplified force tactics. A 10-man team infiltrated 2 miles behind German lines, identified a battalion command post, and conducted a raid that killed several officers and destroyed communications equipment. The raid created chaos in German command structures. Battalion-level coordination broke down temporarily, subordinate units lost contact with higher command, and German commanders diverted reserves to hunt for the raiders who had already extracted back to Allied lines. The psychological tactics extended beyond combat operations. Force soldiers would leave calling cards on German casualties during patrols, markers identifying the unit, sometimes including taunting messages. The practice was psychological warfare, creating impression of invincible opponents who moved through German positions at will. German soldiers began reporting that facing the Devil's Brigade created stress beyond normal combat pressure, not just fear of death, but awareness that their opponents operated with capabilities that seemed to exceed conventional military limitations. German commanders requested reinforcements specifically to counter the force, arguing that standard defensive formations were inadequate for this sector. The requests highlighted the strategic effect. A single Allied unit was tying down German forces disproportionate to its actual size, forcing resource allocation that weakened German capabilities elsewhere on the Anzio perimeter. The force had transformed defensive mission into offensive operations that achieved strategic effect through tactical means. By spring 1944, the cumulative strain on the force was becoming evident. The unit had been in continuous combat operations for months, suffering casualties that conventional units would consider unsustainable. The replacement system struggled to maintain strength. New soldiers required integration into teams where trust and cohesion had been built through shared combat experience. Training could teach tactical skills, but couldn't replicate the psychological bonds formed through surviving operations together. The casualty statistics revealed the operational cost. Since arriving in Italy, the force had suffered approximately 2,500 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, from a total authorized strength of roughly 2,400. The mathematics seemed impossible, indicating that the unit had effectively been replaced entirely through combat losses and replacement personnel. Every original member had been killed, wounded, or was among the small number who had survived continuous operations without serious injury. Yet despite this attrition, the unit maintained combat effectiveness through careful integration of replacements, intensive continuation training between operations, and leadership that emphasized maintaining unit standards regardless of personnel turnover. New soldiers learned quickly that the force's reputation was earned through demonstrated capability, that maintaining that reputation required matching the standards set by those who had fought at Monte la Defensa and Anzio. German forces, meanwhile, developed increasingly sophisticated responses to force tactics. Intelligence officers compiled detailed information about force organization, equipment, and operational methods. Training materials were distributed to units likely to face the force, emphasizing night discipline, enhanced security measures, and rapid response to infiltration. Some German units began conducting their own aggressive patrols, attempting to engage force teams during their approach, rather than waiting passively in defensive positions. These German adaptations achieved mixed results. Enhanced security measures made force operations more difficult and increased casualties during infiltration. German counter-patrols occasionally achieved surprise against force teams, inflicting casualties and disrupting operations. But the fundamental challenge remained. The force's tactical flexibility and aggressive initiative meant they controlled when and where engagements occurred, forcing German forces into reactive posture that was psychologically and operationally exhausting. By mid-1944, as Allied forces prepared to break out from the Anzio beachhead and advance toward Rome, Fifth Army Command had integrated the force into operational planning as a specialized asset capable of missions beyond conventional unit capabilities. They were assigned objectives that required unconventional approaches: reconnaissance deep behind German lines, raids against critical infrastructure, operations in terrain that standard infantry couldn't navigate effectively. The force had evolved from experimental unit to essential element of Allied tactical capability, demonstrating that specialized training and unconventional doctrine could achieve results that conventional forces, however well trained and equipped, could not replicate. The advance toward Rome in May-June 1944 showcased the force conducting operations that blended reconnaissance, direct combat, and exploitation of German withdrawal. As German forces retreated from the Winter Line and Anzio positions, the force operated ahead of advancing Allied armies, identifying German defensive positions, conducting raids that disrupted withdrawal plans, and gathering intelligence about German intentions. These operations required different skills than mountain assaults or static defense. The force teams operated in small groups, often isolated from friendly forces, dependent on stealth and mobility rather than firepower. They moved through territory where German rearguards, retreating combat units, and Italian partisan groups all operated simultaneously, creating complex security environments where identifying friend from enemy required constant vigilance. One operation during this period demonstrated the risks inherent in deep reconnaissance. A force patrol penetrated approximately 15 miles ahead of Allied lines, gathering information about German defensive preparations. During extraction, the patrol encountered a German unit that had established an ambush position along their planned withdrawal route. The firefight that followed lasted approximately 20 minutes before the force team broke contact and escaped, but they suffered 3 killed and 2 seriously wounded from a patrol of 12 men. These casualties highlighted the operational reality. The force's aggressive tactics and deep penetration missions produced intelligence and disrupted enemy operations, but at costs that accumulated relentlessly. Every operation risked lives, every success came with accompanying losses, and the cumulative effect was a unit that maintained effectiveness while constantly integrating replacements to offset attrition. German forces withdrawing toward Rome faced multiple pressures. Allied armies advancing from multiple directions, air attacks against transportation routes, supply shortages, and constant harassment from the force patrols that struck from unexpected directions. German commanders noted in reports that the withdrawal was complicated by inability to secure rear areas. Every supply convoy required significant escort, every command post needed enhanced security, every overnight position faced potential infiltration. The force reached Rome's outskirts on June 4, 1944, among the first Allied units to enter the city. Their arrival ahead of the main Allied advance reflected both their mobility and their operational methods, moving at night, using routes that bypassed German defensive positions, accepting risks that conventional units would consider excessive. The entry into Rome represented not just geographic achievement, but validation of doctrine. Specialized training and unconventional tactics had enabled a small unit to achieve operational effects comparable to much larger conventional forces. But Rome's liberation also marked a transition point. The force had been in continuous combat for 6 months, suffering casualties that would have destroyed conventional units twice over. The question was whether the unit could be sustained, whether the specialized training and operational doctrine justified the human cost. Following Rome's capture, the 1st Special Service Force was briefly withdrawn from frontline operations for rest and reconstitution. The break provided opportunity to integrate replacements, conduct training, and address the physical and psychological strain of sustained combat. Medical officers noted high rates of combat fatigue, soldiers showing symptoms of exhaustion, stress reactions, difficulty sleeping, and hypervigilance that persisted even in rear areas. The unit's effectiveness had come at significant human cost. Interviews with force members revealed that virtually everyone had lost close friends during operations, that many survivors carried guilt about living when others died, that the aggressive tactics that made the unit effective also created constant exposure to situations where death or serious injury was one mistake away. The psychological resilience that selection and training had cultivated was being tested by sustained operational tempo that gave minimal time for recovery between missions. Yet despite this strain, morale remained surprisingly high. Soldiers took pride in their unit's reputation, in achievements that exceeded what larger conventional forces accomplished, in the knowledge that their efforts had directly influenced campaign outcomes. The shared experience of surviving extreme circumstances created bonds that transcended normal military cohesion. These men had climbed mountains under fire, held impossible positions against overwhelming attacks, conducted operations behind enemy lines where capture meant likely death. They had proven themselves and each other in circumstances that eliminated any doubt about individual and collective capabilities. German officers captured during the Rome advance provided revealing testimony during interrogation. Several stated explicitly that their units had been more concerned about encountering the Devil's Brigade than about facing larger Allied formations. One company commander explained that conventional Allied attacks followed predictable patterns that German defensive doctrine addressed effectively, but the force operated unpredictably, attacked from unexpected directions, and maintained offensive pressure that was psychologically exhausting even when not resulting in immediate tactical defeat. This German acknowledgement validated what Allied command already understood. The 1st Special Service Force had achieved psychological effect beyond their material impact. German forces allocated disproportionate resources to defending against potential force operations, maintained heightened defensive posture even when the force wasn't operationally engaged in their sector, and experienced stress that degraded overall combat effectiveness throughout areas where the force might operate. By August 1944, Allied command faced a decision about the force's future. The unit had proven its value but at unsustainable human cost. The specialized mission set that justified its formation, mountain warfare in Norway, had never materialized. The Italian campaign, where the force had achieved its greatest successes, was now secondary to operations in France following the Normandy invasion. The question was whether to continue the unit, redeploy it to other theaters, or disband it and distribute personnel to other formations. The decision came in August 1944. The 1st Special Service Force would deploy to southern France, supporting the Allied invasion there, then be disbanded with personnel distributed to other units. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Force members understood the operational logic. The unit had suffered casualty rates that made long-term sustainment impossible, but regretted losing the identity and cohesion they had built through shared sacrifice. The final operations in southern France demonstrated the force's capabilities one last time. They conducted beach reconnaissance before the main invasion, secured key terrain during the landing, then pursued German forces withdrawing north toward the Alps. These operations followed familiar patterns: aggressive patrols, operations at night, attacks through terrain that conventional forces avoided, acceptance of casualties in exchange for operational momentum. On December 5, 1944, the 1st Special Service Force was officially disbanded. In 18 months of operations, the unit had suffered over 2,700 casualties from authorized strength that never exceeded 2,400, a casualty rate exceeding 100%, indicating the entire unit had been effectively replaced through attrition. They had captured over 30,000 German and Italian prisoners, conducted dozens of successful operations against objectives that had resisted conventional assault, and created psychological impact that forced German commanders to allocate resources disproportionate to the force's actual size. The German assessment of the force was perhaps best summarized by a captured intelligence document from late 1944. German military intelligence had compiled comprehensive analysis of Allied special operations units, evaluating their capabilities, tactics, and effectiveness. The report identified the 1st Special Service Force as exceptionally dangerous, noting that German forces had never developed fully effective countermeasures to force operations, that defending against them required resource allocation that weakened defenses elsewhere, and that their psychological impact exceeded their material effect. The report concluded with frank admission: we could never stop the Devil's Brigade through conventional defensive measures. They operated beyond the limitations that constrained normal military operations, accepting casualties and risks that conventional units would refuse. Their defeat required either overwhelming force concentration, which we could not afford, or accepting that certain objectives would fall to their attacks regardless of defensive preparations. This German acknowledgement represented the ultimate validation. An enemy renowned for military professionalism, tactical sophistication, and operational excellence had concluded that one Allied unit, numbering fewer than 2,500 at any given time, was effectively unstoppable through standard military means. The force had achieved what strategic planners hope for but rarely accomplish. They had created tactical capability that forced operational adaptation from their opponents while consuming resources disproportionate to their size. The 1st Special Service Force's legacy extended far beyond its 18 months of operations. The unit's doctrine, small teams, specialized training, unconventional tactics, aggressive initiative, influenced post-war special operations development in multiple countries. American Special Forces explicitly cited the force as doctrinal foundation when establishing their own capabilities. Canadian Special Operations units maintained direct lineage to the force, preserving traditions and operational methods. The concept that highly trained small units could achieve strategic effects became foundational to modern special operations thinking. The human cost remained undeniable. Over 2,700 casualties from a unit that never exceeded 2,400 authorized strength represented sacrifice that would be unacceptable by contemporary standards. Modern military doctrine emphasizes force preservation, sustainable operational tempos, and casualties minimization. The force operated under different imperatives, achieving critical objectives regardless of cost, accepting casualties as inevitable consequence of aggressive tactics, and maintaining combat effectiveness through continuous replacement of losses. The survivors carried physical and psychological scars for life. Many required extended medical treatment for combat injuries. Others dealt with psychological trauma that 1940s medicine called battle fatigue, and modern understanding recognizes as post-traumatic stress. They had operated at intensity that exceeded normal human limits, sustained by unit cohesion, leadership, and commitment to objectives that seemed worth any personal cost. The German soldiers who fought against the force retained vivid memories decades later. Veteran accounts consistently described encounters with the Devil's Brigade as among their most challenging combat experiences. They respected force soldiers' capabilities, while acknowledging the fear these opponents generated, not panic fear, but rational assessment that conventional tactics provided inadequate defense against unconventional opponents who operated beyond standard military limitations. The acknowledgement that we could never stop the Devil's Brigade came from German officers who had fought across multiple theaters against various opponents. Their professional military judgment gave this assessment particular weight. They weren't admitting defeat by overwhelming Allied superiority. German forces often fought effectively against numerically superior opponents. They were acknowledging that one relatively small Allied unit had achieved tactical effects that exceeded conventional force calculations, that their training and doctrine had created capabilities German military experience couldn't effectively counter. The 1st Special Service Force proved that specialized training, unconventional tactics, and aggressive initiative could enable small units to achieve impacts disproportionate to their size. They forced a militarily sophisticated opponent to admit that conventional defensive measures couldn't stop them, and in doing so, they transformed understanding of what special operations could achieve. If this story made you reflect on excellence, sacrifice, and the power of exceptional training combined with unconventional thinking, remember, those who operate beyond conventional limitations become the opponents that even professional soldiers acknowledge they cannot defeat through standard means.